All right, we've reached the last video in this series, and for this chapter, I'm going to describe actually another scale technique, but once again, it's a scale technique that is built towards focusing on the chord tones. So it's a scale in which the chord tones are still the most important kind of fundamental thing that you are going to play. This time, it is the diminished scale. Okay, let's start with what a diminished scale is. So a diminished scale is built with a pattern, and the pattern is actually really easy. The pattern is you go up a whole step and then up a half step, and then a whole step and then a half step, whole step, half step, etc. And you just keep alternating. And there are actually two kind of ways that people name these. They're actually identical in depending on how you define your starting point. You can either have whole, half, whole, half, whole, half, or half whole, half whole, half whole. Either way, there are actually only 3 of these scales that you can find, depending on what note you start on. So it's actually easier than learning your 12 major scales because there are actually only 3 of these because they share so many common starting points. And once again, we have this pattern. All right, so we're going to use this concept, this diminished scale concept, on the blues. And we can put diminished scales any place that we could have put that same 3, 5, 7, flat 9 pattern that I described in an earlier video. All right, so let's break this down and talk about why this happens. So if we have an F7 chord, before we played 3, 5, 7, flat 9 on that. And the reason was that was resolving towards that B flat 7 chord, which means that we can use those altered extensions like the flat 9. And if we took those 4 notes would be A, C, E flat, and G flat. All right, now those 4 notes alone, without the context of the F root, make up an A diminished 7 chord. The reason that this is important is that tells us that we can play stuff over that F7 chord as if it were an A diminished chord. And because of a really interesting principle about these diminished chords, same thing that gives us only 3 diminished scales, that A diminished chord is actually enharmonically the same as a C diminished chord, an E flat diminished chord, or a G flat diminished chord. So pretty neat stuff. All right, I'm going to play you an example over the blues using these diminished scales, and then I'm going to talk about how I use them. So here's an example over B flat blues. 1, 2, a 1, 2, 3. 3, 4. 3, 4. All right, so there's the blues using some diminished scales. What I would suggest is you look at the PDF or look at your transcription and analyze how I use these scales and how I chose which scale to use, but I'll give you some hints. So once again, I want to focus on the chord tones even within the scales. And so what I'm aiming for is for the 3, 5, 7, and flat 9 in this case to be on downbeats. So for example, on the second bar of what I just played, I'm on an E flat 7 chord, and I'm playing a G whole half diminished scale in this case. So G, and then A, and then B flat, and then C, etc. And if you look throughout the other examples, I'm doing similar things. In this case, I think each time I played an ascending diminished scale. But what you can do is you can look at how I did this, and you can transcribe those little lines and fit them into your own solos. So let's talk about how you're going to practice this. All right, so the first thing is practice those diminished scales. There are only 3 of them. They're the whole half diminished scales and half whole, but they each just start on 3 different roots. Once you get them under your fingers, you're good to go. Way easier than your 12 major scales or anything like that. these diminished scales work in the same places that we were using those flat nines earlier, which means dominant chords that are resolving where you expect them to. So what you could do is you could practice the diminished scales specifically associated with any resolving dominant chords that you have. And once again, I'm playing so that the 3, 5, 7, and flat 9 end up on downbeats. I find it really effective to play whole half when I'm ascending, so I keep getting half-step resolutions into each of those chord tones. And then descending, I'm playing whole half as well, but if you're thinking about it from the descending standpoint. So again, I'm getting the half-step resolutions into each chord tone. So for example, if I'm on a B flat 7 chord, ascending, I might play something like this. 2, 1, 2, 3. Something like that. And descending, I might choose to play this. 1, 2, 3. So using those whole half and half whole diminished scales. All right, so once you have those into your fingers, you can start to weave them into your solo. There are some really kind of straightforward, typical examples of how those are used in the example blues chorus that I played. So check out the PDF or your transcription of that.